Before we begin, there's no need to remember anything. Simply relax, slow your breathing and let this tranquil tale gently carry you into slumber. Good night tonight. We shall step into another London. Not the city of postcards, but one crushed by non-warring forces. It was not the flames of battle that brought it down, but the very air its people were compelled to breathe. You might picture cosy scenes and mist-shrouded streets, but this chapter of history was steeped in the stench of sulphur coal dust and profound dread. Immersed in it now, your first breath would choke you, and every gasp in that opening hour would be a desperate struggle. To grasp the deathly stillness of December 1952, you must first understand the city it enveloped. 7 years after the war, London was a weary contradiction, the heart of a declining empire. A colossal city housing 8.5 million souls, still healing from the scars of bombing. Its skyline reflected both ruin and resilience. The majestic dome of St. Paul's Cathedral rose serenely amid shattered rooftops and soot-streaked brick walls. The air carried a tenacious hope, yet remained perpetually thick with coal smoke. Coal was both the lifeblood and the spectre of this city. It warmed millions of cramped dwellings, powered trains, and fueled the vast factories lining the Thames. The British economy, burdened by war debt, struggled to survive. Thrift was not policy, but daily necessity. Britain's finest exports, even its premium coal, were shipped abroad for desperately needed currency. Left for its battered populace were the remnants for warmth. Low-grade bituminous coal, rich in sulphur, cheap and plentiful, it blazed with foul, acrid smoke. Each dawn from one end of London to the other, millions of chimneys began to breathe, releasing sulphur dioxide and acid mist mingled with fine particles of tar and coal dust. This was the city's daily habit, its beating heart made visible in the air. The odour was the scent of home, a symbol of warmth against damp and cold, the fragrance of barely scraping by. Yet within the smoke lay the fog. London and the mist had forged a long-standing bond, this commonplace sight, filling books and paintings for centuries. The dampness of the North Sea mingled with the city's countless hearths, coalescing into the thick pea soup fog, so named for its resemblance to the thick yellowish-green hue of the worker's meal. This is the London of Charles Dickens, where the mist itself becomes a character seeping into every crevice, concealing streets and burying secrets. It is the London Sherlock Holmes gazed upon. The painter Claude Monet set up his easel here, capturing the strange soft glow as bridges faded into the haze. For most Londoners, the pea soup fog was merely winter's norm, a nuisance true. It stalled traffic-soiled clothes and tickled throats. People endured it silently, occasionally cracking a joke. They learned to navigate by memory, by the feel of the pavement beneath their feet, by the shadows of corner pubs, cultivating an extrasensory faculty to cope with it. Common countermeasures: scarves clamped over mouths and noses, hands feeling for walls ahead. Ears straining for the muffled clatter of trams or the cries of newspaper boys, a nuisance, yes, but a familiar, manageable one. This city had learned to coexist with its foul air just as it had grown accustomed to its winding lanes and shifting skies. In the bitter days of early December 1952, as coal lorries trundled through the streets and chimneys belched thick smoke, none foresaw that the winter fog gathering in the east was an old dreaded foe. This quiet, self-assured city did not anticipate the impending calamity, that it would be gently, slowly suffocated by the very air it breathed. That early December, the weather patterns over Britain showed no anomaly in themselves. Every element conformed to the norm of a British winter. Yet their precise and unfortunate combination, a conspiracy of stillness and cold, constructed a trap of perfect efficiency. The mastermind of this catastrophe was a vast, sluggish, high-pressure system. This colossal weather system drifted westward from Europe like an invisible giant glass bowl, trapping the whole of London beneath its dome. High-pressure zones are areas where air descends and compresses as air sinks it heats up, creating an extremely stable state. This phenomenon is known as temperature inversion. Typically, air near the ground is warmer than that aloft, and rising warm air carries away urban heat and pollution. It is this continuous air movement, the very breath of the sky, that maintains the basic cleanliness of the air we breathe, but the high-pressure system of December 1952 overturned this fundamental principle. It formed a layer of mild warm air hundreds of feet above the ground, weighing heavily upon a layer of extremely cold air trapped near the surface. The sky's natural chimney was completely sealed. The cold, heavy air, saturated with urban exhaust, had nowhere to go, unable to penetrate the layer of warm air above. Worse still, there was no wind at all. The centre of the high-pressure system remained utterly calm for days. The air above London became almost stagnant. Weather vanes stood motionless, flags drooped limply. The gentle breezes that usually swept the city's smog out into the countryside vanished entirely. The smoke and pollutants rising from millions of chimneys and factories had nowhere to escape, neither upward nor sideways. They were trapped within a shallow pool of cold air hugging the Thames Valley. From this moment, every speck of coal dust, every molecule of sulphur dioxide, every flake of tar would linger here, accumulating in an increasingly viscous concoction. The timing could scarcely be worse. The preceding days, though clear, had been bone-chillingly cold, prompting Londoners to burn far more coal than usual for warmth. The city's large power stations operated at full capacity, their chimneys belching thousands of tons of pollutants to meet the electricity demand. The domestic hearth, that cherished heart of the English home, became an unwitting accomplice. Across the sprawling urban landscape, millions of identical fireplaces saw cheap sulphurous coal fed relentlessly into their flames. The cumulative effect was staggering. Estimates suggest the city pumped into its enclosed spaces daily 1,000 tons of soot particles, 2,000 tons of carbon dioxide, 140 tons of hydrochloric acid, 14 tons of fluorine, and the most lethal component, 370 tons of sulphur dioxide. These chemicals stirred dark currents within the cold, damp, stagnant air, the fog itself, that classic pea soup thicket, composed of countless minute water droplets. Sulphur dioxide from coal fires dissolves within these droplets. Catalyzed by other atmospheric components, it transforms into weakly acidic yet highly corrosive sulfuric acid. The fog ceases to be a mere mixture of soot and water, gradually evolving into a floating chemical haze. Acrid clouds spreading through the air, catalyzed by other airborne particles, it transformed into weakly acidic yet highly corrosive sulfuric acid. The fog was no longer a simple mixture of soot and water vapour, but was evolving into a floating chemical haze. These acidic clouds stung the eyes, burned the lungs, and eroded stone London's geography. A city sprawling across a broad river valley exacerbated the disaster. Cold, heavy, polluted air flowed into the basin like water into a shallow bowl. The surrounding hills, such as Hampstead Heath, to the north and the high ground to the south, formed natural barriers sealing in this poison. Through a perfect convergence of industrial habits, economic necessity and fortuitous weather, the city had constructed its own gas chamber. For 4 days it would remain trapped within. The trap was simple in construction, ingenious in design, and devastating in consequence, yet utterly invisible to the millions living in the valley below. They merely felt the chill deepening unconsciously, stoking their fires higher, unwittingly feeding the monster forming above them. On the morning of Friday the 5th of December, Londoners awoke to a familiar sight, thick, damp winter fog. This was no cause for alarm. Commuters adjusted their ties, wrapped their scarves tighter, and stepped into the grey haze. Initial reports from the Meteorological Centre described calm conditions, mentioning scattered patches of fog and tranquil weather, with a forecast that the mist would lift by midday. This prediction would prove to be a dreadful and tragic error. This was no ordinary fog. As the morning light deepened, the mist not only persisted but grew denser and heavier. Its nature began to undergo an unprecedented transformation, shifting from pure white or smoky grey to a sickly yellowish brown, then to a murky, dirty brown. In the worst affected areas, it congealed into an almost solid, greasy black fog. As if the very heavens were solidifying, an overwhelming sense of eeriness descended. The odour struck first and hardest. Not the familiar, almost comforting scent of coal smoke, but a pungent chemical stench that assaulted the throat, triggering violent coughing. It was the raw metallic bite of sulphur, so potent one could almost taste the air. People felt a burning pain in their eyes and nose, accompanied by a persistent itch that water could not soothe deep within their throats. Violent coughing erupted. It was the raw metallic sting of sulphur, so potent it felt as though one could taste the very air itself. People felt a burning sensation in their eyes and nose, an itch that persisted despite washing. This mist even had a tangible quality, not a crisp, moist vapour, but a greasy, murky spray that left a sticky black grime on every surface it touched. Windowsills, railings, doorsteps were all coated. Pedestrians' collars and cuffs turned black after brief walks, hair coated in slime skin gleaming with oil. A fine layer of black soot covered everything inside and out, a constant reminder of grime, a stark declaration of what people were breathing. Then darkness descended. At Friday noon, in the heart of a world-class metropolis, daylight was nearly extinguished. The faint crimson sun of dawn had vanished entirely, replaced by an unnaturally deep twilight that forced streetlights to illuminate now mere blurred points of light in the gloom, their beams stretching scarcely a few feet as the visible world contracted at a terrifying pace. Initially, one could still see across the street. Within moments, only half the distance remained visible. Soon people reported being unable to see the pavement beneath their feet. The world abruptly contracted into a taut sphere of perception, its diameter no greater than an arm's length. The void beyond one's field of vision seemed as though it had never existed. This sudden blindness dealt a catastrophic blow to the city's operational systems. London, a metropolis entirely reliant on the flow of people and goods, began to grind to a halt. The bus network, the primary transport for millions of citizens, collapsed. First drivers could scarcely make out the curbside, let alone the vehicle ahead, forcing them to pull over repeatedly, futilely attempting to maintain service. Some conductors were issued with signal flares or torches, forced to walk ahead of crawling buses, guiding drivers forward in agonizing inch-by-inch increments. In the thick darkness, the scene seemed to transcend time, torch-bearers leading colossal red beasts through hellish landscapes. This futile and perilous operation persisted until Friday evening, when virtually all London bus services ground to a complete halt. The rail network fared scarcely better. Signalmen strained within their control rooms to discern the colour-coded lights governing train safety. This system, reliant on visual checks, began to collapse. Delays spread like a plague across the entire network, culminating in the wholesale cancellation of all services and the stranding of hundreds of thousands of commuters within the city, London Underground. The city's subterranean refuge proved equally vulnerable. The fog, denser than clean air, surged into the network through stairwells and escalator shafts. Suffocating stations and tunnels, platforms became hazardous. Their edges indistinguishable, drivers on surface lines had to lean sideways out of windows, straining to make out signals mere inches away. The city's social and cultural life ground to a halt. Performances of La Traviata at Sadler's Wells Theatre were halted mid-show as fog seeped into the auditorium, its density so thick that, Audiences could not see the stage and singers could scarcely see each other. Cinemas across the capital closed in succession. Performances were halted midway as thick fog permeated theatres, obscuring the stage from the audience and leaving actors barely able to see one another. Cinemas similarly shut down as projector beams could not reach the screens. Sporting events were cancelled one after another. The scene at Smithfield Market, the site of London's annual livestock show, was desolate. Prize cattle confined within the Earl's Court exhibition enclosures began suffering severe respiratory distress. Veterinarians rushed to administer emergency treatment, but for many animals their robust lungs proved no match for the toxic air. They suffocated to death on the spot. Those caught within were plunged into bewilderment. Londoners who prided themselves on navigating the city's labyrinthine streets found themselves utterly lost mere steps from their doorsteps. Familiar landmarks that served as mental anchors, church spires, corner shops, distinctive pubs vanished entirely, leaving the world a hollow, cacophonous void. Sounds, too, became distorted. The city's clamour reduced to scattered, intimate noises, the rustle of unseen footsteps, the intermittent cough of someone nearby, the anxious jingle of a bicycle bell. The city was frozen by its own air into blindness and silence. When Friday night fell, it brought not ordinary darkness but a deepening of the thick night that had already swallowed daylight, while the smog continued to intensify. The silence began slowly, then descended abruptly. At noon on Friday the 5th of December, London's complex circulatory system began to congeal. The iconic red double-decker buses, symbols of routine and reliability, became the first major arteries paralysed. In the hardest-hit eastern districts, where smog hung thickest over areas like Stupney and Poplar, visibility plummeted to less than a metre. Through their windscreens, drivers saw only churning yellowish-grey void. The world halted abruptly before the front grille. Thus an absurdly theatrical ritual unfolded across the city. Conductors accustomed to punching tickets and ringing bells in warm carriages were forced off their vehicles, becoming reluctant guides. They stepped into the biting gloom, one hand holding aloft a burning signal flare, the other waving a lantern, and began walking. They walked mere inches ahead of the bus's enormous, now defunct headlights, shouting directions to drivers who could only follow the faint flickering light. It resembled a procession through time, a 10-ton mechanical beast escorted by a medieval torchlight brigade, moving slower than weary pedestrians. Reality naturally proved untenable. Journeys that should have taken 20 minutes stretched to 2 or 3 hours timetables, becoming utterly fictitious. In Dog Island, buses were abandoned by their crews, becoming colossal red spectres parked by the roadside, vanishing into the mist mere feet away, only to reappear days later. Transport for London, the city's chief conductor of daily commutes, soon declared defeat. Public transport services first suffered delays, then ceased, entirely trapping hundreds of thousands of citizens. With surface roads, paralysed people abandoned their vehicles and walked staggering forward, with arms outstretched to feel walls and railings navigating by memory and touch. This urban juggernaut had regressed to primal conditions. Those seeking refuge poured into the underground rail network, only to encounter another form of chaos within the tiled tunnels. Though the air was fresher, the system was overwhelmed. Victoria Station, Piccadilly Circus and Leicester Square platforms were packed to capacity, dense crowds, awaiting trains that crawled by at a snail's pace. The problems extended beyond the underground. London's complex underground system, particularly in the suburbs, featured extensive above-ground lines. These areas, like the city streets, had descended into blind zones. Fog signalmen were dispatched to the tracks, placing explosive devices to provide audible signals for drivers, visual signals having failed. Yet this battle was doomed to failure. Signals paralysed, points frozen. The underground's precision clockwork timetable utterly shattered. The few trains still running were suffocatingly crowded, their carriages filled with the mingled odours of damp woolen coats and the collective anxiety of a million interrupted journeys. For many, the underground was no longer a refuge but a trap. Above ground, the colossal rail hub connecting London to the nation lay silent. The steel-framed glass dome of Paddington Station, once a majestic temple celebrating steam and speed, now sheltered only stillness. Departure boards displayed lists of cancelled services. Trains to Bristol, Cardiff, Cornwall all suspended. A thick cold smog heavier than air hung over the tracks, obscuring signals and rendering movement too perilous for engineers to attempt. Stranded passengers slept soundly on benches wrapped in coats, while the stations echoed with emptiness. Only the occasional ethereal announcement from the loudspeakers broke the silence, declaring yet another delay, another surrender to the air itself. King's Cross and Euston stations shared the same fate, severing the northern routes to the capital. The latest mode of transport to conquer the skies now stood as the most helpless entity. At what would later be known as Heathrow Airport, not a single aircraft took off or landed for an entire day. Concrete runways vanished into the thick fog, pilots circling endlessly with nowhere to land, unable to locate this city, existing only in name. Subsequent flights were rerouted to Manchester and Amsterdam, deliberately bypassing the British capital shrouded in thick fog. Roads, railways and air routes lay severed, yet the deepest, most eerie silence descended upon the Thames. London's liquid artery, the very raison d'etre of the city, had ceased flowing for centuries. The ceaseless flow of vessels that once pulsed through its veins, the city's unstoppable heartbeat, had now ceased. All shipping lay dormant, ocean-going liners bound for the royal docks, anchored at the estuary, their crews gazing at the grey walls. Tugboats and barges, the lifeblood of the port, lay moored in stillness. River police on patrol boats could only wait ashore. The Thames had become a lifeless channel, its oily, smooth surface reflecting not the sky, but the sickly, boundless haze over London docks, the world's busiest port, sealed not by war or strike, but by the weather. The city had become an island, adrift in a sea of self-woven mist like a blind colossus. When the modern metropolis, this marvel constructed of intricate systems, was struck down by the invisible laws of physics, it ceased to breathe. This blind zone did not stop at the threshold. The smog, like a cunning regular, disregarded the boundaries of indoor and outdoor etiquette. Composed of countless viscous coal dust and tar particles, mingled with droplets of sulphuric acid, it not only obscured vision but seeped into the city's very fabric, slipping through window frame cracks, sliding down chimneys, creeping beneath door thresholds, flowing beneath old house floors, permeating within hours. The boundary between indoors and out blurred, a greasy black film coated every surface. Housewives would wipe down furniture at dawn, only to find dust resettled by lunchtime. The air within homes and workshops carried the same metallic bitterness as the streets, the taste of soot and chemicals lodging deep in the throat and crystallizing on the tongue. Curtains and carpets absorbed the foul odour, becoming Londoners' perpetual companion. Londoners had no choice but to struggle for survival within this siege. They dwelt amidst a diluted version of the toxic fog that choked the streets, immersed day and night in suffocating air. Upon waking, pillowcases bore faint traces of coal dust from their own breath. The simple act of lighting the gas stove revealed the air's condition. The flame starved of oxygen curled into a sickly dark orange. No longer the clear blue star, yet life must go on, or at least attempt to continue. People moved through their homes with sluggish, cautious steps, yet the city's communal life had already evaporated. The grand experiences that bound the urban community together were fading one by one. At Sadler's Wells Theatre, Verdi's La Traviata was performing its first act. As the lavishly costumed singers on stage gradually faded into indistinct silhouettes, their voices seemed to seep through the misty vapour infiltrating from the sides. This mist now slowly yet resolutely swept across the orchestra pit and surged into the auditorium. The conductor could scarcely make out the concertmaster, while spectators in the upper tiers could only perceive a faint wavering glow where the stage should have been. Ultimately, the performance was forced to halt. The manager was compelled to ascend the stage, or what he hoped was the stage, to announce the show could not continue. The theatre was now shrouded in impenetrable fog. The cultural feast had come to an abrupt end. London's cinemas were no different. The very technology of cinema that focused beam of light piercing the film had become its fatal flaw. The dust in the air made the projector's beam visible and tangible, a dazzling cone of light stretching from the projection booth to the screen. Yet this startling effect rendered the images on the screen utterly blurred. Audiences at the Granada in Tooting or the Odeon in Leicester Square found themselves staring more at the air than at the film screenings were forced to halt. The notion of fleeing to Hollywood ultimately succumbed to the heavy reality of London's air. Life retreated into small private worlds. The famed London pub, the cornerstone of community, became a peculiar refuge. With doors shut tight, the bar's light illuminated only a few feet. People crowded around the counter. Voices muffled conversations intimate and confined by obstructed sightlines. One person at one end of the bar might not see those at the other. It was a strangely fractured social gathering. Within this universal darkness, the city offered an opportunity for the socially awkward. The law, like all things, demands visibility. The deterrent power of patrolling officers stems from their presence and their ability to survey the whole scene. Yet, in the thick fog, officers and citizens alike were blind. Footsteps could be heard mere paces away, yet the source remained unseen. Criminals naturally recognized this effective paralysis of policing. Post-minus instant studies revealed crime rates surge from data point to data point. It became a thief's paradise. Pickpockets vanished instantly into shadows. Burglars' silhouettes blurred with the gloom as they pried open windows. Rumors even circulated of pedestrians lured into dead minus-end alleys. Victims robbed before their cries for help faded into the mist. It was said that audacious criminal gangs attempted to exploit the thick fog to break into bank vaults, calculating that no one would witness their crimes. The fog created an atmosphere of extreme vulnerability, with people groping their way through the streets, isolated and helpless, constantly alert to threats lurking beyond their field of vision. The psychological toll of this sensory deprivation was immense. Londoners, accustomed to teeming crowds and constant human presence, found themselves utterly isolated for 5 days, even in the city's busiest districts. The familiar urban symphony vanished, the roar of traffic, Big Ben's distant chimes, street vendors' cries, replaced by an unsettling, muffled silence. Sounds that should have been distinct became distorted and misplaced, their origins impossible to pinpoint. A cough could come from any direction distant. Unseen chimes' footsteps seemed right beside you, yet belonged to a stranger 10 yards away. This city, this metropolis defined by its landmark, would itself appear distorted and misplaced if one could pierce the fog, its source unit unfightable. A cough might originate from any direction distant. Unseen chimes' footsteps seeming to echo beside you, yet belonging to a passer-minus by 10 yards away. This city, defined by its landmarks and layout, has lost its geographical coordinates. Trafalgar Square appeared like a rural scene through the haze, and streets inhabited for a lifetime were enough to disorient. This was profound disorientation, the stripping away of familiarity, leaving only suffocating darkness. Cold and damp within and without, the city was no longer a place of refuge, but an atmosphere to endure, a hostile presence permeating every corner of life. The initial sensation was irritation, eyes stinging, throat parched. Londoners are no strangers to fog, even thick as pea soup, a familiar theme in the works of Dickens and Conan Doyle. The first reaction was bitter complaint, mocking the weather with dark humor. But by Saturday, the second day of the haze, the nature of the complaints began to shift. The irritation was morphing into something more insidious. The coughs grew deeper, wet rattling coughs that seemed to erupt from the very depths of the chest. For the healthy, this was already sufficiently unpleasant for the frail. It marked the beginning of a life minus and minus death struggle. As the smog lingered in the stagnant air trapped by a high minus pressure system, it underwent a deadly chemical reaction. Vast quantities of sulfur dioxide emitted from city chimneys, and power stations reacted with water droplets in the mist, transforming into weak sulfuric acid. Londoners inhaled not merely smoke, but corrosive mist. It was a direct chemical assault on the fragile tissues of the respiratory system. The bronchi, the body's first line of defense, swelled and constricted rapidly. The body instinctively secreted mucus to protect the airways, only to make matters worse. The already narrow passages became blocked, turning breathing into a painful struggle. Each shallow gasp delivered more suffocating toxins rather than life-minus-staining oxygen. The first to succumb were those with inherently weakened defenses, the elderly, whose lungs, having endured decades of London's air pollution, could no longer resist, and young infants, whose underdeveloped respiratory systems were overwhelmed. A third group comprised Britain's vast post-war population of chronic respiratory sufferers. Decades of coal smoke, industrial pollution and heavy smoking had afflicted multitudes with chronic bronchitis, a condition so widespread it was grimly dubbed the British disease. For these sufferers, the smog was not mere nuisance but a death sentence. Their already inflamed airways became completely obstructed, and they began to suffocate to death under their own roof. By Saturday evening, the city's healthcare system began showing tremors. Doctors on call navigated the thick fog, carrying black medical cases to one critical scene after another. Entire households laid low, elderly gasping in their fireside chairs, lips and fingernails turning blue from oxygen deprivation. Doctors could offer only palliative care. They could not cure the air itself, only advise patients to rest at home. How ironic that advice seemed when indoor air was nearly as toxic as the outdoors. Then came the flood of patients, a trickle at first, then a torrent. People poured into the emergency rooms of St Thomas's, Guy's, the Royal London, and countless others, some walking, some supported by family, others crammed into ambulances crawling through the city at a snail's pace. The official ambulance service itself fell victim into the fog. Streets of zero visibility, disoriented drivers, stretching response times from minutes to hours, or rendering them impossible. In desperation, Smithfield market porters were conscripted. His navigators of the labyrinthine streets were enlisted, driving their own lorries at a crawl, with pedestrians clearing the way ahead. They transported the sick and dying to hospitals. What began as orderly processions descended into chaotic disorder. Wards filled first, then corridors became packed with patients, some seated on chairs, others lying on stretchers, some simply leaning against walls. Every soul struggled for each breath, the air thick with a harrowing chorus wheezing, choking, and heart-wrenching cough. The smog had seeped in here, nurses unable to see from one end of the ward to the other, repeatedly tripping over unseen equipment, identifying patients only by their breathing sounds. Doctors, utterly exhausted, shuttled between critically ill patients. Demand for oxygen surged, yet delivering new oxygen cylinders to the hospital had become a logistical nightmare. Vehicles carrying life-saving oxygen were wrapped in gridlock that paralyzed everything. Most patients were initially diagnosed with severe bronchitis or pneumonia, yet the sheer scale of the outbreak was baffling. It was as if a suffocating plague had descended upon the entire city. Medical staff were witnessing the first mass casualties in a modern metropolis caused purely by air pollution. Modern cities had never faced such a catastrophe. and the Department of Health, the central government body responsible for public health, was slow to react. Initial reports were treated as a local issue, dismissed as an exacerbation of common winter ailments. Whitehall appeared oblivious to the gravity. No city-wide emergency alert. No coordinated public health warning. The message to citizens remained stay calm, advising against strenuous activity, yet for tens of thousands, the simplest act of breathing had become lethal. By the third day, the situation deteriorated precipitously. Funeral homes ran out of coffins. Florists could no longer supply funeral flowers. The death toll rose silently, not through sensational public deaths, but through quiet, solitary disappearances in bedrooms and wards across the sprawling city. Neighbors discovering elderly women collapsed in chairs, infants dying in cradles from respiratory failure, middle-aged men with fragile chests whose lungs ceased functioning entirely. The suffocating grip of smog tightened relentlessly, while municipal authorities remained as oblivious to this medical catastrophe as citizens were to the streets before them. The air meant to sustain life now claimed it, on an industrial scale, with no dawn in sight through the thick fog. The air meant to sustain life is now taking it on an industrial scale, with no sign of the thick fog lifting. The air itself has become the enemy. This is no ordinary smog, not the classic London fog that obscures vision and bites with icy cold. This is something entirely different, an active air chemistry event, a silent, random assault ravaging the microscopic level of every breathing man, woman, and child's lungs. To comprehend the city's paralysis, one must first grasp the weapon deployed. It was born in the stoves of millions of homes and the furnaces of thousands of factories. Its raw material was coal, not the fiercely burning, relatively clean anthracite, but the cheap, soft, high-sulfur coal of the post-war rationing era. Each lump shoveled into furnace or boiler was both ancient compressed sunlight and a chemical time bomb. On 5 December 1952, all detonated simultaneously. Burning, this coal released common pollutants, dense black clouds, sudden carbon dioxide, yet its most insidious agent was sulfur. Within the flames, sulfur atoms bonded with atmospheric oxygen to form sulfur dioxide SO. This colorless gas carried a pungent, suffocating odor, akin to the sharp sting that catches in the throat when striking a match. Under normal conditions, this gas would have risen with the hot air from chimneys, diluted by water for pouring and dispersed as a pollutant across a vast area. Yet conditions were far from normal. A high-pressure system hovering over the Thames Valley acted like a lid, sealing London in. It could neither rise nor move sideways, creating a stagnant, enclosed atmosphere. Thus, sulfur dioxide, along with millions of tons of coal smoke, was pumped directly into this sealed, atmospheric chamber. It accumulated steadily over time, growing denser with every shovel fuel of coal thrown onto the fires. The fog became an accomplice. London's fog was no ordinary vapor, but a filthy industrial haze. Each minute droplet condensed around a core of dust or soot, filling the air with countless suspended microminous water globules laden with impurities. In such saturated conditions, sulfur dioxide dissolved into the mist, saturating it and transforming each droplet into a miniature chemical factory. The dissolved gas molecules reacted further with atmospheric oxygen, a process accelerated by other pollutants such as nitrogen oxides and trace metals present in industrial soot. Sulfur dioxide SO transformed into sulfur triacate, which upon encountering water HO underwent an immediate, violent reaction, forming HSO, or sulfuric acid. This fog was not merely mist, but a diluted aerial acid bath, a haze of sulfuric acid. Londoners breathed air laden with trillions of fog droplets, each becoming a miniature chemical factory. This was its lethality. People inhaled not just smoke and moisture, but a fine spray formed by one of the world's strongest acid. The initial symptom was irritation. The potent acid corroded the sensitive mucous membranes of the nasal passages, throat, and bronchi, triggering the body's defense mechanism. The airways constricted in an attempt to block the toxins, while the mucous membranes secreted thick mucus to trap foreign particles and neutralize the chemical irritation. For healthy individuals, this induces violent coughing, sore throats and watering eyes. Unpleasant but survivable. Yet for vulnerable groups, infants whose lungs are not yet fully developed, the elderly whose respiratory systems have weakened with age, and those with underlying conditions like asthma, bronchitis, or heart disease, this chemical assault amounts to a death sentence. Their bodies cannot cope. The acidic fluid not only irritates but actively destroys tissue, scorching the tree-minus-like structure of the bronchioles and triggering inflammation in the alveoli, the crucial microscopic air sacs where oxygen and carbon dioxide exchange occurs. The alveoli, the very site of this vital gas exchange, are eroded. The body's own defenses become a fatal trap. Areas already constricted by disease become completely sealed off, while protective thick mucus accumulates in the remaining spaces, forming viscous blockages. Patients suffocate from the inside out, as if drowning on dry land, their lungs transformed into battlefields where the very air sustaining life becomes the weapon of destruction. The scale of chemical emissions was staggering. Daily coal combustion was estimated to pump into the stagnant air 1,000 tons of soot particles, 2,000 tons of carbon dioxide, 140 tons of hydrochloric acid, and 14 tons of fluorides. Yet the true culprit, the architect of this mass casualty event, was 370 tons of sulfur dioxide, suspended in the air. It was transforming at a rate of nearly 800 tons of sulfuric acid per hour, waiting to be inhaled. This was the ultimate silent weapon, rendering an entire city captive without the need for armies. London's very air had become a plague, and within the grand halls of the Earl's Exhibition Centre, the invisible toxin's savage power was laid bare with chilling clarity. As the smog tightened its noose, the city celebrated the pinnacle of British agriculture, the Smithfield Cattle Show. This time Minas honoured gathering brought together the nation's foremost livestock breeders and experts. Contestants from across Britain presented their champion animals, meticulously bred over generations. These extraordinary prize cattle, Aberdeen Angus, Hereford, and Galloway, stood imposing and sleek, their meticulously groomed coats gleaming within the pens. They epitomize robust vitality, symbolizing rural strength and national pride. These treasures, temporarily housed in West London's vast Echo Hall, command considerable sums. On the 5th of December, the first full day of the smog, staff noticed something amiss. The air within the ventilated hall grew thick and acrid, and the normally docile herd began to stir, low coughs spreading between the pens. Then initially, the blames fell on environmental shifts in transport stress. Yet by the turn of Friday into Saturday, the air within Earl's Court had thickened to the murky yellow of the streets, visibility plummeting to mere feet. A pungent, metallic sulfur stench permeated everything, while the livestock's coughs grew heavier and more desperate, their robust bodies quivering with violent gasps. Visibility plummeted to mere feet, the acrid stench assaulting the senses, a foul odor of sulfur and metal clinging to everything. The livestock's coughing grew heavier and more desperate, violent gasps beginning to shake their sturdy frames. Those once calm, large, watery eyes were now wide with terror and agony. The on Minas site veterinarians stood bewildered. Dozens, even hundreds, of healthy, robust animals had simultaneously succumbed to a mysterious respiratory disease. They examined feed, water, bedding, finding nothing amiss. The true enemy was the air itself. The creatures' exquisitely developed lungs, once the powerhouse driving their massive frames, had now become their fatal weakness. With every labored breath, sulfuric acid from the air was drawn deep into their systems, systematically destroying their respiratory tracts from within. Desperate measures followed. Attendant-soaked cloth sacks in whiskey and rum, strapping them over the animals' mouths and noses like makeshift gas masks in a futile attempt to filter the poisonous fume. The pungent odor mingled with smoke and the animals' anguish, yet the acid mist proved too dense and pervasive, seeping through as if the damp cloths were non existent. By Saturday evening, the first livestock fell, a prized breeding bull, the owner's cherished treasure, suffocating in its pen. This death delivered a profound shock, followed immediately by another. The scene within the Earl's estate transformed into a surreal nightmare. The dim electric lights cast a hazy glow in the stagnant air, forming indistinct halos. People frantically darted between pens, attempting to soothe the dying beast. The hoarse gasps of hundreds of struggling animals, the terrified shouts of keepers, and the low moans of the dying creatures formed a heart-rending symphony. Throughout the weekend, champions of British agriculture fell one after another, the death toll steadily rising. Ultimately, over 60 of the 350 exhibiting cattle fell gravely ill, 12 dying on the spot, their massive carcasses in the exhibition hall standing as grim testament to the air's toxicity. Dozens more were so severely affected they had to be EU than is dead after the show. A veterinarian performing post-mortems described their lungs as completely blackened, inflamed and swollen, as if suffering chemical burns. The tragedy at Smithfield laid bare the lethal nature of smog in a uniquely stark manner, while thousands of Londoners perished silently in homes and wards. Their deaths remained private tragedies, unrecorded by the state apparatus. Yet the demise of these prize cattle became news, publicly displayed assets whose deaths possessed a concrete, quantifiable undeniability, providing a brutal metric for the toxins in the air. If the smog could claim the life of a prime Hereford bull weighing 1,000 pounds, what harm might it inflict upon elderly pensioners suffering from bronchitis or infants in their cradles? The sight of these mighty beasts suffocating within their pens utterly shattered any illusion that this was merely another ordinary fog. Under the exhibition hall's dim lighting, this became a stark and unambiguous warning. London's air had transformed into a killer, wielding terrifying, indiscriminate lethality. The city was not merely afflicted, it was undergoing a chemical assault. Yet within the very heart of power, the Whitehall government's response was profoundly, almost surreal. Apathy. Those bearing the responsibility of governing Britain remained utterly unaware of the disaster's magnitude during its critical initial days, nor did they grasp its full implications. Their Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, then in his 70s, was leading his second peacetime government. His concerns were wholly absorbed by grand strategy in the global order, the Korean War, the Soviet Union's growing nuclear threat, Britain's precarious position in the world economy. Had anyone suggested the London weather warranted his personal attention, it would likely have been dismissed as preposterous. Meanwhile, Harold Macmillan, the Secretary of State for the Home Department, whose remit included air pollution, remains largely unaware. This future Prime Minister, a genteel, composed Edwardian gentleman renowned for his calm, almost theatrical political demeanour, remained utterly oblivious to the unfolding crisis. Initial reports channeled through the civil service were dismissed as routine administrative matters rather than emergencies. When parliamentarians first raised concerns about the fog's dangers, the official response was dismissive. It was merely a weather phenomenon. Unpleasant, certainly, but typical London pea soup fog, and would dissipate naturally. The concept of a public health crisis was entirely absent. There was no system for real milestone death tracking. The process was slow, paper-based, and bureaucratic doctors would sign F certificates citing bronchitis, pneumonia, or heart failure as the cause. which would then be sent to local registrars. Only weeks later would the central office collate these thousands of slips of paper, witnessing the horrifying statistics surge that was the moment of truth. The government possessed only hearsay, which could easily be dismissed. On Monday, 8th December, the fourth day of the city's paralysis, with thousands dead or near death, the matter was raised in the House of Commons. The Parliamentary Secretary for Health delivered a response that epitomized detached understatement, acknowledging the smog caused distress and deaths had risen, yet assuring Parliament there was no need for alarm and offering no further explanation. The government's primary concern was not public health, but public order in the economy, maintaining train services to transport supplies and prevent the capital's complete paralysis. Human lives were a secondary, almost abstract consideration. This inaction stemmed from multiple factors, genuine gaps in understanding. Even experts did not widely comprehend the science of sulfur dioxide transforming into sulfuric acid within the fog and deep minus seated political inertia. Acknowledging the man minus made disaster coal smoke would mean confronting the reality that Britain's economy and people's livelihoods depended entirely on cheap, dirty coal. They provided heating, powered factories, and generated electricity. Any genuinely effective fuel regulation measures, whether mandating equipment for businesses or establishing smoke-free zones, would be prohibitively expensive and politically perilous. This would entail confronting powerful industrial lobbies and dictating to millions of citizens what fuel they could burn in their own hearths. For a conservative government championing free enterprise and minimal state intervention, this was unthinkable. It was far easier to turn a blind eye, blame the weather, and wait for the wind to shift. Even the horrifying revelations from the Smithfield exhibition failed to rouse Whitehall from its slumber. Harold Macmillan later recounted the episode in his memoirs with his characteristic detached humor, noting that it would have meant confronting powerful industrial groups and dictating to millions of citizens what fuel they could burn in their own hearths. For a conservative government committed to free enterprise and minimal state intervention, this was simply inconceivable. It was far easier to stand idly by, blame the weather, and wait for the wind to change direction. Even the horrifying reports from the Smithfield Fair failed to rouse Whitehall from its slumber. When Harold Macmillan later recounted the incident in his memoirs, he still approached it with his characteristic detached humor, noting that waiting for the wind to change direction. Even the harrowing scenes at Smithfield Market failed to rouse Whitehall from its slumber. When pressed on the matter in his memoirs, Harold Macmillan still referred to it with his characteristic detached humor, noting that his cabinet had been blamed for the cattle deaths. There was neither urgency nor alarm. The government seemed trapped within its own intellectual pressure system, as isolated from street-level reality as the City of London was from the clean air above the inversion layer. Churchill himself, the legendary figure who had rallied the nation against Nazi Germany with rousing speeches, remained silent. The lifelong cigar smoker, already prone to respiratory difficulty, was reportedly laid low by the smog, yet he issued no public statement, offered no words of comfort, and initiated no emergency response. This great wartime leader, this savior of the nation, appeared indifferent to the silent war waged by air that was quietly eroding the lives of his people. His focus lay instead on preparing an address concerning the nation's economic situation. The contrast could scarcely be starker. Whilst Londoners suffocated in darkness, their Prime Minister fretted over the pound's exchange rate. The government's failure to grasp the scale of the smog in its early stages was not a conspiracy, but a more disturbing and fundamental failure, a lack of imagination. They could not conceive that a modern industrial city could be paralyzed, and that thousands could perish, not by bombs or poison gas, but by the ordinary, familiar smoke rising from chimneys. As undertakers ran out of coffins and florists sold their last blooms, His Majesty's government maintained a deliberately composed official stance, merely mist. It would dissipate. Saturday, 6th December, London's machinery began to break down. There was no thunderous crash, no dramatic collapse, only a slow, agonizing paralysis. This intricate clockwork of 10 million cogs was suffocating on its own breath. The tally had begun, unofficial, for no one could yet count systematically. The figures were etched in the minds of ambulance drivers, recorded in undertakers' ledgers, and lodged in the weary minds of hospital registrars. These were not official statistics, nor could they be systematically recorded. They existed in the minds of ambulance drivers, in undertakers' ledgers, and deep within the weary minds of hospital registrars. The first warning sign came not from meteorologists or government officials, but from those ordinary souls who silently traverse the boundary between life and death. The London Ambulance Service, that proud and efficient institution, was on the brink of collapse. Calls that once signaled swift response now became desperate cries hurled into the thick, yellow minus black haze. An ambulance dispatched from Lambeth Station to the terraced houses of Brixton, a journey normally taking mere minutes, now became an epic odyssey into the unknown. The driver rolled down the window, letting the biting wind and churning air assault him as he leaned out, straining to make out the curve just steps away. This journey, normally a matter of minutes, had now become an epic voyage into the unknown. Despite the biting cold and the harsh air, the driver rolled down the window, leaning his body far out of the cab, his eyes fixed intently on the curb just a few feet away. Often, another attendant would walk slowly ahead of the creeping vehicle, holding a torch, not a modern battery, minus powered flashlight, but typically a coarse cloth, soaked in paraffin and wrapped around a wooden stick. This primitive, flickering light, held high like a medieval procession. This faint, flickering point of light their sole guide, a fragile talisman in the suffocating darkness. They followed the tram tracks, the grooves in the road like a tangible map guiding the wheels. They relied on memory to recognize direction, counting the streets on either side, positioning themselves by the echoes of the engine colliding with invisible walls. A journey that should have taken 10 minutes stretched to an hour, then 2, and, in the rear of the carriage, life might be slipping away, the wheezing of a bronchitis sufferer growing fainter, the weary final beats of an elderly heart nearing its end. The paramedics could hear these sounds, yet were powerless to hasten the journey. Like sailors adrift in a toxic sea, they arrived too late most times, before the porch illuminated by the searchlight. Bereaved family members' warm asks of sorrow, shaking their heads, mission aborted, patient deceased. The ambulance promptly turned around in the center of the unseen street, laboriously completing a 3-point turn, before beginning its blind crawl back to the station. Another casualty recorded. Not a name, but a futile, unfulfilled mission. Sometimes the ambulance itself became the sacrifice, colliding with abandoned vehicles or mounting curbs to become immobilized. Red lights flickered futilely in the gloom, their silent pulsing, unnoticed, a distress signal. As ambulances failed one after another, the city's dead began to pile up. This was a tangible problem, a logistical challenge, one a city ought to manage. London in 1950 had long grown accustomed to death's predictable rhythm. An entire industry and professional system had been built around this ultimate, unavoidable ritual. But the smog shattered that rhythm, utterly destroyed it. London's daily death toll, usually around 300, had doubled by Saturday and tripled by Sunday. The entire system began to collapse under the sudden weight of death. The first to feel the strain were the undertakers, these mostly family-run workshop, tucked away in high streets and back alleys. Their dark, understated shop fronts familiar symbols in the cityscape. They prided themselves on quiet dignity and impeccable service. But dignity had become a luxury the city could no longer afford. Phones in the back rooms of Illingston or Stepney funeral parlours rang incessantly, fielding calls from bereaved families whose voices were aught with grief and panic. Calls from hospitals warm or desperate still. Morgues, designed to hold only a handful of bodies for a day or two, were overwhelmed. The deceased were laid out in corridors, chapels, and any available cool space, covered only by thin sheets. Hospitals urgently needed to free up space. Upon accepting a commission, the undertaker could only record the details and promise to do his utmost, then face a series of insoluble logistical puzzles. His hearse navigated the streets with the same difficulty as ambulances. Transporting a body from a hospital a mile away became a perilous journey consuming half a day. Even if one managed to bring it back, where would it be placed? The cramped mortuary at home was already at full capacity. Every inch of space precious. He called colleagues who normally competed for business, now comrades in adversity. The response was invariably the same. Phone. No room. All in the same boat. Then came the more acute shortage of coffins. A demand that had remained stable for generations surged suddenly. Workshops, which had previously produced only 5 or 6 caskets a week, now faced orders for 20, 30, even 40 at a time. Craftsmen toiled in workshops littered with sawdust, working by the dim light of a single lamp, utterly unable to keep pace. Oak was exhausted, pine depleted, brass handles and silk linings equally scarce. The entire supply chain ground to a halt. Timber failed to reach workshops. Finished coffins could not be delivered to funeral homes. These somber items piled up, yet could not reach the desperate market. Families were told to delay burials by a week or even 2, leaving the deceased stranded. The customary rituals of mourning, viewing the body, the solace of a dignified, prompt burial, were all put on hold. The dead, like the living, were suspended in limbo. As coffins ran out, so did the flowers. In a final, bleakly poetic twist, this city that poisoned its citizens with egg no longer produced the traditional funeral wreaths required for burial rites. Flower markets like Covent Garden themselves were shrouded in smug-cut blooms transported from the countryside withered in the toxic air, their petals browning and wilting before they could be sold. Florists with remaining stock were inundated with orders, wreaths, bouquets, simple baskets, which vanished from counters as soon as they appeared. Soon, shops stood bare. London was devoid of flowers, the city itself running out of symbols for remembrance. This was not mere cold statistics, but a cascading chain reaction. Ambulance drivers could only apologize. Hospital porters stacked bodies, shrouded in linen along child corridors. Funeral parlors' phones rang incessantly with no coffins to offer. Mortuaries ran out of space. Carpenters worked until their hands were raw, hastily crafting makeshift caskets that still couldn't meet the demand. The florist stands in his empty shop, forced to tell a grieving son there are no white lilies to be found. Each minor tragedy a professional failure and personal despair. When these multiply by the thousands across the vast city, they become the imprint of catastrophe, a silently suffocating plague paralyzing the modern metropolis from within. This city is not merely dying, its capacity to manage death perished long before death itself. For long days and 5 nights, London held its breath. On Monday, 8th December, a peculiar, weary fatalism enveloped its people. The world compressed to a few feet of vision, confined to rooms within 4 walls, with only the intermittent sound of one's own cough echoing. Sunlight became a forgotten myth. Fresh air, a distant memory. The entire city lay like a patient induced into coma, vital signs flickering faintly. Yet, on the morning of Tuesday, 9th December, a change began to unfold. Initially, it was not a change visible to the naked eye, but rather a sensation, a subtle shift in the air, a new quality within the silence. Above the layer of polluted smog, in the crisp, cold air enough, the stubborn high minus pressure system that had plagued the city for nearly a week finally began to weaken. A biting, northwesterly wind, born of the Atlantic's clear expanse, swept eastward across the British Isles, like reinforcements arriving in the dead of night. Its gentle yet resolute pressure began stirring the stagnant pool of smog at dawn on Tuesday. It was as if a giant hand had silently lifted the lid of a sealed vessel. The first to notice were residents of elevated areas like Hampstead and Highgate. Upon waking, they found an eerie pallid glow filtering through their window. Not yet daylight, yet a welcome escape from the oppressive, absolute darkness. Gazing out, the outlines of rooftops across the street gradually emerged, followed by chimneys, then entire ridge lanes. The smog did not dissipate naturally, but was swept away from above, rolling downwards like a soiled carpet across the city basin. The transformation was slower in the alleys, yet undeniable. Commuters and passers-by felt a breeze brush their faces, a genuine flow of air, cold and damp, yet fresh and clean, utterly devoid of foul odors. After days of breathing chemical soup, this air felt like the most precious nectar. People drew deep breaths, for the first time in days, no longer feeling as though they were swallowing mouthfuls of grit and acid. This shift swept through the city like a tide, tearing vast cracks and drips. In the tapestry of mist, buildings would suddenly emerge from the haze, familiar Portland stone facades appearing startlingly real within the surreal world. Double-decker buses, parked roadside for days, gleamed with an almost unbelievable brilliance from their bright red bodies. For the first time in 5 days, London glimpsed the sky, a winter canopy like a pale watermark, a faded canvas woven of grey and silver. Yet it was there. The sun appeared, not as a blinding orb, but as a faint, milky halo behind thin clouds, like a cream-colored smudge behind gauze. Yet this light struck like an electric current. Pedestrians halted to gaze skyward, faces turned towards the heavens, blinking repeatedly in the long absent illumination. It was a collective, silent moment of release, as 8 million citizens finally drew their first breath of pure air. That colossal dome of polluted air, a toxic haze 15 miles in diameter and hundreds of feet thick, was steadily being pushed eastward, flowing down the Thames estuary. It transformed into an invisible river of venom, traversing the marshes of Kent and Essex before dissipating into the cold, unforgiving expanse of the North Sea on Tuesday afternoon, steadily pushed eastward, flowing along the Thames estuary. This invisible river of poison reversed the marshes of Kent and Essex, ultimately dissolving into the cold, unforgiving expanse of the North Sea. On Tuesday afternoon, the Great Smog of 1950 came to an end. The air cleared, the siege lifted, and a strange, almost frenzied energy swept through the city. The sense of liberation was palpable and intoxicating. London restarted, tram and bus engines finally coughed back to life. Resuming their routes, the underground was no longer the city's sole lifeline. Returning to its regular, rhythmic pulse, shops opened their doors, factories reignited their furnaces. The supreme unconscious irony in the city set about the task of cleaning up. What a colossal undertaking it was. The city emerging from the haze resembled a monochrome nightmare. Every surface coated in a greasy, viscous black film. The majestic white stone of St. Paul's Cathedral and the Houses of Parliament bore streaks of soot, as if the buildings themselves were weeping inky tears. Statues of kings and generals transformed into pitch-black monsters. Window panes veiled in grime. Every piece of furniture, every plate, every book within the houses was coated in a fine layer of black dust. Housewives launched into a massive clean, up. Yet the acrid, metallic taste of the smog lingered on carpets and curtains for weeks. As the physical grime was scrubbed away, a more unsettling sight gradually came into focus. A brief moment of relief when the city reconnected. News began to spread. Newspapers, printed and distributed normally for the first time in days, carried the first cautious reports transport paralyzed, sporting events cancelled, the entire city at a standstill. But the reports also began mentioning hospitals, beds desperately needed, medical staff overwhelmed. The true scale of the disaster whispered through pubs and circulated along garden fences. It seemed everyone knew of an elderly aunt who had passed away quietly on a Sunday night, struggling to breathe, of a neighbor's asthmatic child rushed to hospital and never returned, of a colleague gasping for air. These tales spread quietly in pub conversations and garden fence chats. It seemed everyone knew someone who had passed the elderly aunt who slipped away quietly on a Sunday night, the neighbor's asthmatic child who was rushed to hospital and never returned, the colleague absent on Wednesday whose family later confirmed he died suddenly from severe bronchitis. These were not sensational public deaths, but private tragedies unfolding behind closed doors in thousands of homes across the capital. They were attributed to familiar causes: pneumonia, heart failure, chronic bronchitis, precisely because they were familiar. People were more inclined to dismiss them as winter norms, yet the sheer density of these death stories made them impossible to ignore. Funeral homes operating through the night to clear backlog, funeral appointments booked weeks in advance, demand for burial plots reaching historic highs. On London streets, the slow procession of black hearses became an all-minus-to-minus common sight, a somber estimate to the price the city paid for its cleaner air. That collective sigh of relief on Tuesday morning proved premature. The air was fresher, yet it carried the scent of the departed. London had survived, yet now awoke to a terrifying realization. It had just endured a silent massacre, a deadly plague that remained invisible until its very end. The tallying of casualties had only just begun. The government, or more precisely the Department of Health, under its ambitious new minister, Ian MacLeod, took the lead in quantifying the disaster. Days after the smog lifted, as evidence mounted in the press pressed for answers, the government urgently needed a figure to define the catastrophe scale. The vacuum created by official silence, especially when filled with public fear, spurred statisticians into action. The registrars at the General Register Office set to work doing what statisticians do best: counting. They examined death certificates registered across Greater London during the smog period, the 5 days from Friday the 5th to Tuesday the 9th of December. They compared this figure with the average number of deaths for the same period in previous years. The calculation was straightforward. The method direct. They counted those who died directly from the smog, deaths recorded during or immediately after the event. The figure ultimately submitted to Parliament was staggering. Approximately 4,000 deaths attributable to the smog. 4,000 additional lives lost in just 5 days. To put it in perspective, this exceeded the total number of Londoners killed in any single week of air raids during the Second World War. The figure of 4,000 became the official conclusion, shocking and undeniably tragic, yet ultimately a controllable, finite number. This allowed the event to be defined as an exceptional occurrence, a terrible but isolated catastrophe, a natural disaster wrought by the deadly poison of abnormal weather conditions intertwined with urban smoke. The government's narrative contained both sober acknowledgement and understated certainty. This would become the historical footnote for a generation. Committees sprang into existence, and investigative reports poured forth. The Beaver Commission, chaired by Sir Hugh Beaver, ultimately catalyzed the landmark Clean Air Act of 1956. Yet the immediate focus lay in containing the situation, quelling the ongoing political fallout, while addressing the devastating human toll. The figure of 4,000 seemed to draw a line under the events, but the truth remained far from settled. The government's initial statistics, with their characteristic bureaucratic precision, contained a significant miscalculation, not a lie, but an incomplete truth. It failed to grasp the insidious erosion of the smog upon the human body. The toxins did not dissipate with the wind over the sea, but accumulated persistently within the body. Not lies, but merely fragments of the truth. It failed to grasp the insidious, persistent erosion of the smog upon the human body. The toxins did not vanish into the ocean with the wind, but lingered in the lungs and blood streams of tens of thousands of Londoners. For most victims, the Great Smog was not a swift killer, but a slow torment. Initial statistics covered only the 5-day event, akin to gauging a war's impact by battlefield casualties alone, overlooking the tens of thousands who succumbed to lingering effects in the weeks and months following December 1952. London's mortality rate never returned to normal, stubbornly undisturbingly remaining elevated. A battle, counting only the fallen on the battlefield, yet overlooking the thousands who succumbed to their wounds in the weeks and months after the war. After December 1952, London's mortality rate never returned to normal, remaining stubbornly undisturbingly elevated. City physicians witnessed surges in respiratory and cardiac ailment. Elderly survivors of the smog fell ill with pneumonia in January. Middle-aged men with pre-existing heart conditions suffered fatal heart attacks in February. These death certificates made no mention of the smog as the cause of death. The direct causes listed included congestive heart failure, acute bronchitis, myocardial infarction. Yet the true culprit, the fatal factor that pushed these already weakened bodies over the edge, was the chemical assault they endured in December. The investigation into this silent massacre began years later, not through a government commission, but through the meticulous examination of dry registry archives by epidemiologists and medical statisticians. They adopted a sharper perspective, examining not just the 5 days of smog, but the entire winter mortality data for 1950 to 1953. They plotted weekly death rates onto a graph. The result was not a spike, but a terrifying mountain. The peak emerged in early December, yet its broad, steep slopes stretched for months. They charted weekly mortality curve, revealing not a spike but a chillingly massive mountain, its summit appearing in early December, while its broad, lofty slopes extended for months on either side. They calculated not only weekly excess deaths, but also examined the entire period from December 1950 to March 1953. After subtracting expected deaths for a typical winter, the remaining figures reveal the true brutality of the smog. Modern studies, benefiting from decades of hindsight and more sophisticated statistical methods, produced bleaker, new data. The death toll was not 4,000, but closer to 12,000. 12,000 men, women, and children killed by the air they breathed. This staggering revision, which omitted to -thirds of victims from initial estimates, transformed the Great Smog from a severe public health crisis into one of modern history's deadliest environmental catastrophes, an incalculative vast silent holocaust in peacetime. Even this figure fails to capture its full toll. Behind every fatality lay countless others afflicted with severe chronic illnesses. It is estimated that the smog caused approximately 100 severe respiratory illnesses among London's residents. Young children who inhaled the acidic air suffered permanent lung damage, leaving them prone to illness for life. What had once been a concert hall joke, the London cough, became a chronic affliction for an entire generation. City hospitals overflowed with victims of the smog. The economic toll from lost labor and medical expenditure was immense, yet the cost in lives, silently shortened and filled with suffering, was incalculable. Lifting the veil on this silent slaughter revealed a disturbing truth. The Great Smog was not a natural disaster, but a man-made catastrophe. The inevitable outcome of a series of deliberate choices. The choice to power the metropolis with cheap, high-sulfur coal, the choice to allow millions of households to vent in filtered soot from their chimneys, the choice to let the post-war fuel board export premium low-sulfur coal for precious for unexchanged, while forcing Londoners to burn the dirtiest, most toxic residue, commonly known as nut coal. This was the inevitable byproduct of a century of industrial development, where the very air itself was treated as an open sewer, a free, bottomless pit for dumping the refuse of progress, while the anticyclone that trapped the smog was a natural phenomenon. The toxins it sealed within were wholly of human origin. In its quest for warmth and energy, London had effectively built its own gas chamber. For 5 days in December, the entire city forgot to open its windows. The ultimate toll of 120 Zara lives was not a meaty or logical statistic, but the bloody reckoning for decades of collective neglect. When the air finally cleared, the silence that lingered was utterly different. No longer the grave minus-like stillness born of the fog itself, but the heavy, expectant quiet following a terrible discovery. For 5 days, London suffocated beneath its own shroud. Amidst the biting mid-minus, December glare and startling clarity, the city began to reckon with its toll. The initial figures emerging from hospitals and coroners' offices were horrifying enough, yet they were merely the vanguard of the statistical storm, the prelude to the storm. The true scale of the catastrophe remained uncomprehended, merely sensed, a profound collective trauma settling into the city's mirror. Yet within the corridors of Westminster, the initial response was a disciplined, almost masterful denial. This was Britain in the 1952, a nation that prided itself on tightening its upper lip, carrying on, and keeping quiet. The government, led by the indomitable Winston Churchill, was preoccupied with the Cold War, economic recovery, and the slow dismantling of the empire. A severe weather event was dismissed as an inconvenience. Harold Macmillan, then Secretary of State for Housing and Local Government, the future Prime Minister, renowned for his Edwardian calm, casually attributed the incident in Parliament to the will of heaven and an aberration of the climate. He spoke of the catastrophe as though describing a particularly severe winter flu. Tragic, yet ultimately unavoidable. He declared no inquiry was needed, nor any fanfare. The cause was obvious: the fog. It was well known that fog, like the Thames and St Paul's Cathedral, had long been a symbol of London. As indispensable as the Thames or street poles, investigating the smog would be akin to investigating rainfall. This stance appeared superficially reasonable, delivered with measured calm, yet constituted a grave misjudgment. It underestimated the simmering anger accumulating within the city's terraced houses and council flats, failing to grasp that this was no ordinary fog, but an entirely different catastrophe, a man-made plague. As the populace well understood, the press keenly sensed, the public mood shift and pursued the story relentlessly. Newspapers that had focused on the fog's chaos and novelty now published death tolls. Reports emerged of undertakers running out of coffins and florists selling out of funeral wreaths. Doctors described patients with blue lips suffocating in wards using clinical detachment. The news fermented through daily accumulating headlines. The government's initial estimate of several hundred deaths was swiftly exposed as a fantasy by brutal reality. The General Register's weekly report, a dry publication normally of interest only to actuaries and civil servants, suddenly made front-page news. Data revealed deaths surged by 4,000 above normal levels during the week of December. Per 1,000 lives. As subsequent weekly figures emerged, the numbers continued to climb. Delayed effects, persistent respiratory infections. The final death toll was estimated to approach 12,000. This peacetime catastrophe rivaled the scale of a major military rout. Parliamentary pressure became unbearable, with backbenchers from all parties responding to constituents' outcry, launching sharp and furious interpellation. Labour MP Norman Dodds introduced a private member's bill demanding action. Becoming a steadfast and passionate advocate for change, he refused to accept Macmillan's dismissive rebuttal, committing the public's suffering to parliamentary record and transforming bureaucratic debate into a catharsis for public outrage. Irrefutable evidence and undeniable mortality statistics forced the government to yield. Its strategy of waiting for the issue to fade had failed. The memory of that black fog remained too vivid, the pain too acute. Now all understood action was imperative. Thus, in July 1953, the government, with almost palpable reluctance, announced the establishment of a new body, the Air Pollution Committee. This was Britain's classic crisis response model from a committee. Yet this was no ordinary committee destined to produce reports gathering dust on shelves. Its leader was Sir Hugh Beaver, a formidable civil engineer and industrialist, who also served as managing director of Guinness Brewery. Neither politician nor career civil servant, he was an expert in systems operation, logistics management, and practical implementation. He mastered the art of construction, understood the mechanics of operations, and crucially, knew how to dissect the root causes of failure. Beaver was tasked with conducting a comprehensive investigation into the fundamental causes and impacts of air pollution, and devising practical preventive measures. This body, later known as the Beaver Committee, approached its work with cool, rigorous determination rather than political fervor. They drew upon meteorological experts, explaining the science of temperature inversion, clinicians from London's leading teaching hospitals providing heart-wrenching clinical data on respiratory failure, engineers dissecting the mechanics of industrial furnaces and domestic stoves, and economists meticulously calculating the toll of the smog not merely in lives lost, but also in stalled production, damaged buildings, and healthcare expenditure. They conducted field investigations in the boiler rooms of Battersea Power Station and examined the rudimentary fireplaces in East End dwellings. They delved into the very nature of the smog, commissioning experts to analyze the chemical composition of coal, certain specific properties of sulfur dioxide particles, the very particles responsible for the immense harm. For a full year, they worked in silence, rigorously verifying evidence, alternately amassing a mountain of irrefutable proof. In November 1953, they issued an interim report warning the government the smog was no natural disaster, but a direct product of pollution, primarily from coal combustion. The report recommended immediate short-term measures. The following November, the final report was published, a masterpiece of clarity and logical rigor, delivering a sober and severe indictment of a century of industrial and domestic practices. The report declared the culprit was unquestionably coal smoke, emanating not only from the great chimneys of power stations and factories, but from millions of inefficient open coal fires in homes. Each cozy hearth, each comforting stove, was a miniature, unregulated chemical factory pumping toxins into the air. The committee's vision was revolutionary and transformative, calling for a fundamental shift in the nation's relationship with its primary energy source. They heralded a new era of control, regulation, and accountability, demanding clean air in essence. They presented the government with a detailed, practical, and politically irrefutable blueprint for change. The age of complacent ignorance had ended. The era of action was about to begin. The Beaver Committee's final report, submitted in autumn 1954, was no document to be lightly dismissed or shelved. Its arguments were incisive and precise. Its proposed plan nothing short of revolutionary, not violent revolution, but a quiet legislative transformation that would touch every home and factory nationwide. At its core lay the establishment of smoke-freeze zones and smoke control areas, a concept both simple and profoundly disruptive. It mandated that towns implement district-by-district controls, rendering any chimney emitting black smoke illegal. This was not a ban on heating itself, but a restriction on specific combustion methods within designated areas. Within these zones, residents would be prohibited from using primitive coke-fired stoves. Progressing district by district, towns would prohibit any chimney from emitting black smoke. This was not a ban on fire itself, but a restriction on combustion methods within designated areas. Residents could no longer burn rock coal in open hearths and were switched to smokeless fuels, coke, anthracite, or high minus calorific, low minus smoke artificial solid fuels. A more radical transformation lies in gas or emerging electric heating systems. This directly challenges the very foundations of British domestic life. Coal fires represent not merely a heat source, but a cultural tradition and the symbolic heart of the home. For many, the notion of the government dictating what may be burned in their own hearths constitutes an astonishing intrusion. Political obstacles loom, large supply issues remain unresolved. Can the nation produce sufficient smokeless fuel? Though the National Coal Board and gas industry made pledges, logistical challenges proved daunting. Cost was equally severe. Replacing coal minus-fired appliances with modern equipment was prohibitively expensive. Recognizing this, the board proposed government subsidies covering up to 70% of conversion costs for homeowners. This was, in essence, a pragmatic acknowledgement national problems require national solutions. One cannot simply command people to keep clean, one must help them bear the cost. The legislative process commenced, with the bill undergoing drafting, debate, and revision amid considerable turbulence. Opposition arose from industrialists concerned about the expense of upgrading stoves and constructing taller chimneys, precisely the core recommendations of the Beaver Report, aimed at dispersing residual pollutants above ground level. Others argued that individual liberty outweighed public welfare. Yet the harrowing memory of December 1950 proved potent political fuel. The spectres of 12,000 victims haunted the debate, transforming into a silent, irrefutable demand for action. The newly appointed minister, Duncan Sandys, spearheaded the bill's progress through Parliament, building upon the groundwork laid by his predecessor, Macmillan. Sandys positioned the legislation in the House of Commons not as restrictive regulation, but as a charter for public health, marking a modern step towards a brighter, cleaner future for the nation. Finally, on 5 July 1956, nearly 4 years after the smog had lifted the Clean Air Act received royal assent. This pioneering legislation addressed air pollution through the world's first comprehensive, systematic approach. Its effectiveness lay in a decentralized, phased implementation strategy, granting local authorities the power to investigate their jurisdictions and, upon central government approval, designate smog control zones. This approach enabled efficient policy rollout, radiating outward from the most polluted city centres. Pollution-stricken London pioneered the new law, with administrative districts, including the City of London, Westminster, and Holborn successively declaring themselves smog control zones. Progress was achieved through public notices, awareness campaigns, and subsidy distributions. The legislation simultaneously targeted industrial pollution. New factory furnaces were mandated to employ smokeless technology, while existing plants faced compulsory reductions in soot emissions. The principle of tall chimneys became enshrined in law. New power stations along the Thames estuary were equipped with colossal chimneys reaching 600 feet, engineered to propel residual fumes aloft where prevailing winds would disperse and dilute them. This offensive essentially comprised two parts: reducing total soot emissions at source through domestic clean fuels, while ensuring unavoidable emissions from heavy industry were kept far from public lungs. Its implementation constituted a monumental logistical endeavor, taking decades to complete. It was both a process of enforcement and persuasion. Health visitors went door to door promoting the benefits of new fuel, while newspapers and the emerging television media extolled the virtues of modern clean gas and electric heating, instilling these advantages in an entire generation of Britons. The figure of the coal merchant, that perpetually soot-stained face hauling heavy sacks across golden paths, gradually faded from view, replaced by gas fitters or electricians. The transformation was not sudden, but a slow and persistent purification. Winter fog did not vanish overnight. The air still occasionally turned murky and yellow. Yet such foul weather grew increasingly rare and mild. The suffocating, thick smog of Victorian legend and the nightmarish smog day of 1950 became relics of the past. The 1956 Clean Air Act was not merely legislation, but a profound declaration, a societal turning point where burning cheap, polluting fuels was collectively deemed no longer worth the cost of human lives. The fog had become a thing of the past. Enacted in 1956, the Clean Air Act stood not just as law, but as a profound statement, a moment of collective societal resolve. The convenience of burning cheap, dirty fuels was no longer worth the price of human lives. This marked a triumph of public health over industrial inertia, of scientific evidence over political denial, and a quiet victory achieved through the profound civility of the civil service. London learned its lesson in the most painful manner, thereby setting an example for the entire world. Britain's air may never be utterly clean, but thanks to this act, it will never again claim lives on an epic scale. The legacy of the Great Smog of 1950 did not end with the passage of the Clean Air Act. Its reverberations persist to this day, a low, enduring rumble beneath the clamour of the modern world. Within London itself, the Act's effects unfolded gradually over the following decades, revealing the reborn city in slow motion. London's architectural landscape began to transform. For centuries, monumental structures like St Paul's Cathedral, the Houses of Parliament, and the British Museum had been cloaked in a uniform pall of black soot, symbols of an empire choked by smog. From the 1962, a massive cleaning campaign commenced, removing colder stone by stone and facade by facade, revealing the pale Portland stone and warm brickwork buried for generations. London literally brightened, its colour palette shifting from monochrome to more vibrant hues. The city's very essence began a slow yet remarkable revival. The Thames, after a century as a biologically dead, oxygen minus depleted sewer, started to breathe again. Cleaner air meant reduced acid rain and less direct deposition of pollutants into waterways. A 1957 survey found no fish remaining in the Thames tidal zone, but by the 1972, environmental regulations like the Clean Air Act began to show results, and fish populations started returning. Today, the river hosts over 20 species of fish, along with seals, and occasionally even strayed dolphins. This stands as testament to nature's resilience. When the relentless pressure of pollution eased even slightly, the very air Londoners breathed was transformed. The air Londoners breathe is fundamentally different. Winter daylight hours have doubled, and the stubborn coughs that plagued generations are gradually disappearing from the city's list of ailments. The thick fog that once defined the city, a classic image in Sherlock Holmes stories and film noir, has become a historical relic and folk memory. Through engineering, London eliminated its most famous and deadly atmospheric feature. Yet the fog's most profound resonance is global. This disaster marked a pivotal turning point in humanity's understanding of the connection between human activity and the environment, in how we comprehend the relationship between human activity and the environment. Prior to 1952, pollution was often viewed as a local nuisance, a necessary cost of progress and prosperity, a mark of employment, a symbol of economic vitality. The Great Smog shattered this illusion for the first time. Modern technological society was clearly unstated to be capable of producing lethal environmental catastrophe through its everyday operation. This was neither a distant war nor a famine in a foreign land, but the air of one of the world's most advanced cities transformed into poison. This realization planted a seed. It demonstrated a scientifically provable political link between specific pollutants, in this case, coal, smoke, and specific public health disasters. Crucially, it proved that concerted legislative action could effectively resolve the problem. The 1956 Clean Air Act became a blueprint and case study for the burgeoning global environmental movement, forming the bedrock of environmental regulatory philosophy. By the 1960s, when scientists, as Rachel Carson revealed in her seminal work Silent Spring, began sounding the alarm on pesticide hazards, London's precedent already existed when concerns over industrial waste polluting rivers prompted the United States to enact the Clean Water Act in the 1970s. Its legislative logic followed the framework of Britain's Clean Air Act. The core principle remaining unchanged: society possesses both the right and the responsibility to control harmful pollution to safeguard public health and the natural world. Thus, the Great Smog of London is not a chapter consigned to the dusty annals of history, but a recurring script in modern society. Its lessons continue to be replayed in the vast metropolises of the 21st century. Though the chemical composition of the air has changed, the fundamental problem remains unresolved. The thick, yellow-black sulfur house smog that blanketed London in the 1950s has found its contemporary equivalents. The grey-brown photochemical smog enveloping Beijing, the choking clouds of fine particulate matter over New Delhi, and the ozone-laden air stinging the lungs of Mexico City's residents. The root cause is no longer domestic coal burning, but a complex concoction of vehicle exhaust, industrial emissions, agricultural burning, and coal-fired power plants hundreds of miles away. Yet the narrative remains strikingly similar: rapid economic growth and industrial expansion priorities progress above all else, leading the public to gradually accept a certain level of air pollution as the new normal, until a tipping point, perhaps Beijing's apocalyptic air, where visibility plunged to mere tens of meters, or New Delhi's public health emergency triggered by the chart's pollution readings, compels confrontation with reality. Social media amplifies public outcry, wielding influence far beyond that of the 1950s to generate political pressure. Initially hesitant governments are forced into action, commissioning studies when pollution levels breach limits, forcing people to confront reality. The amplified public outcry on social media, a mode of communication unimaginable in the 1950s, generated political pressure. Governments often resisted at first, but were ultimately compelled to act, commissioning studies, implementing emergency measures like traffic restrictions or factory shutdowns, and gradually embarking on the arduous process of formulating and enforcing long-term, stringent environmental regulations. The spirit of the Committee of Sir Hugh Beavers resonates in every modern scientific panel advising government on air quality standards. The spirit of the Clean Air Act permeates every international climate agreement and every municipal regulation seeking to establish low-emission zones. The London smog disaster taught the world a crucial and painful lesson. The atmosphere is not a bottomless cesspool. There exists a tipping point where the air we depend upon can turn against us. This 1952 event sounded the warning shot from the first great urban heart of the Industrial Revolution. It stands as an eternal admonition: the clean air we take for granted is not a divine gift, but a fragile achievement won through tragedy, investigation, and political will, a will that chose the long-term health of its people over the short-term conveniences of a fossil-fuel world. The smog has long since lifted from London streets, yet its shadow still hangs over us all. As this silent tale draws to its close, you need do nothing more. If you have already drifted into slumber, may this quiet hour gently linger through the night. If you still lie awake, rest here, if you will, until your heart is content.